The text from my sister Delilah hit my phone at 9:43 p.m. "Don't even think about showing up tomorrow, Cassandra. You'll just embarrass yourself and ruin my perfect day." Little did she know, the perfect venue she'd been bragging about for months, Silverstone Manor, belonged to me. And in exactly 12 hours, she was about to discover that her failure of a sister controlled the entire celebration she'd planned for her 30th birthday. Let us know in the comments where you're watching. If this resonated, don't miss out on subscribing because tomorrow I'm sharing something that will completely change how you think about this topic. I stared at the message glowing on my phone screen, sitting in my home office in Ridgewood Heights, surrounded by contracts and financial documents that told a completely different story than what my family believed about my life. At 28, I was supposedly the family disappointment. The sister who threw away her engineering degree to work at some tiny catering company downtown, living in what they assumed was a run-down apartment, driving a beat-up Honda that was clearly all I could afford. What they didn't know was that the tiny catering company was actually Cascade Events and Hospitality, which I'd built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire over the past 5 years. The company owned 8 premium venues across the Westmont Valley, including Silverstone Manor, the stunning lakeside estate where Delilah was supposed to celebrate her milestone birthday tomorrow evening with 200 of her closest friends and colleagues. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my actual home, a custom-built modern house on 35 acres of private waterfront property worth more than my parents' house and Delilah's new townhouse combined. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family pitied me for my struggling lifestyle, I'd been quietly building something extraordinary. The text from Delilah was the final blow in months of escalating hostility. It had started when she'd begun planning her 30th birthday celebration, what she called her Dirty 30 Glamour Bash. From the moment she started organizing, Delilah had made it clear that she wanted everything to be perfect, and my presence somehow threatened that perfection. "Cassandra just doesn't understand the vibe I'm going for," she told our mother during a family brunch, not realizing I could hear every word from the kitchen. "All my friends are successful, put-together professionals, my colleagues from the law firm are coming, and some very important clients will be there. I can't have my struggling sister making people uncomfortable with questions about why she's still working some dead-end catering job." Our mother, Patricia Holloway, had tried to mediate, but even she shared Delilah's concerns. Maybe Cassandra could help with some of the setup work. She does have experience with events, even if it's just small-scale stuff. Small-scale stuff. If they only knew that small-scale stuff included managing the tech billionaire's product launch last month or coordinating the senator's fundraising gala that had raised $2.8 million for childhood education. But I had learned long ago that explaining my actual success to my family only led to accusations of lying or showing off. It was easier to let them assume what they wanted to assume. My family had constructed an elaborate narrative about my life that was so detailed, it was almost impressive in its wrongness. They believed I worked for someone else's small catering company, probably making around $32,000 a year. When I'd tried to explain that I owned my own business, they'd assumed I was freelancing or running some kind of side hustle. "It's sweet that Cassandra calls herself an entrepreneur," Delilah had said to her fiancé's parents at a recent dinner. "We all have to start somewhere, right?" My living situation was another source of their concern. Because I drove a practical car and dressed simply, they'd concluded I was struggling financially. My mother had actually offered to help me with my rent payments last Christmas, and Delilah had given me a gift card to Target with a note about helping you get some nice things for your place. The truth was that I'd developed these habits during my business's early years when every dollar needed to be reinvested, and they'd simply become my lifestyle. Why spend $300 on dinner when $40 would be just as satisfying? Why buy an $80,000 BMW when my reliable Honda served the same function? My family saw frugality and assumed poverty. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago during what was supposed to be a family dinner to finalize birthday plans. Delilah had reserved the private dining room at Thelmont's, an upscale restaurant in the historic district. I'd arrived wearing a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry, my usual understated style that my family interpreted as trying to look expensive on a budget. Delilah's law firm colleagues were everything she'd described: wealthy, connected, and very concerned with appearances. They'd spent the cocktail hour discussing their recent vacations, investment portfolios, and career achievements. When the conversation turned to me, the condescension was immediate. "And what do you do, Cassandra?" asked Jennifer Walsh, one of the senior partners, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer wouldn't impress her. "I work in event planning," I replied simply. "Oh, how lovely," she said, with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Small parties, corporate luncheons, that sort of thing?" What followed was 30 minutes of Jennifer and her colleagues discussing their own event planning experiences. The charity galas they'd hosted, the corporate events they'd attended, the real event planners they'd worked with for serious occasions. Each story was clearly meant to illustrate the difference between their world and what they assumed was mine. The most painful moment came when Jennifer mentioned that they'd originally wanted to hold the birthday party at Silverstone Manor. "It's absolutely stunning," she'd gushed, "right on Lake Serenity with those gorgeous gardens and the historic mansion. But it's so exclusive. There's apparently a waiting list and they only work with certain planners." I'd nearly choked on my wine. Silverstone Manor had been fully booked because I'd made the decision 18 months ago to limit events to 15 per year, focusing on ultra-high-end celebrations that maintain the venue's exclusivity. Jennifer's firm had been turned away not because of a waiting list, but because their inquiry had come during our brief restructuring period after I'd acquired 2 additional properties. "Well," Delilah had said, "we found something even better. Lakewood Gardens has its own charm, and they were available on my date. Sometimes things work out exactly as they're meant to." Lakewood Gardens, the venue Delilah had booked after being rejected by Silverstone Manor. The venue she'd spent months raving about, calling it even more perfect than her original choice. The venue that was also mine, part of my portfolio of premium properties. That's when Delilah had delivered her devastating announcement. "Actually," she'd said, her voice carrying clearly across the private dining room, "I need to talk about the guest list." Everyone had turned to look at her, expecting perhaps a sweet speech about friendship and celebration. Instead, she'd looked directly at me. "I've been thinking about the party, and I've realized that I want everything to be absolutely perfect. Really perfect. Which means I need everyone there to reflect the life I'm building, the professional success I've achieved." She'd paused dramatically. "Cassandra, I'm sorry, but I don't think you should come to my birthday party. It's nothing personal, but my colleagues and friends are all at a certain level professionally and socially, and I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or out of place." The silence that followed was deafening. Our parents had looked mortified. Jennifer and her colleagues had exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely surprised. And I'd sat there processing the fact that my own sister had just uninvited me from her birthday party because she was ashamed of what she thought my life looked like. Now, 12 hours later, I sat in my home office waiting for the chaos to begin. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. The family that had spent years underestimating me was about to learn exactly who they'd been dismissing. And my sister, who had just kicked me out of her birthday party for not being successful enough, was about to discover that her perfect venue belonged to the sister she deemed unworthy of celebrating with her. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply revealing the truth. If you're loving what you're hearing, smash that subscribe button. It really keeps us going. All right, let's jump back in.
The next morning, I woke up to 14 missed calls and 26 text messages. But before dealing with the chaos that was undoubtedly brewing, I wanted to understand exactly how my family had constructed their version of my life over the years. The narrative they had built was so far from reality that it was almost impressive in its completeness. It had started during my senior year at Westmont Tech University. While my classmates were interviewing for corporate positions and talking about their post-graduation plans, I'd been quietly working on a business plan that would eventually become Cascade Events. My family saw my secretive behavior and late-night computer sessions as signs that I was struggling academically or having social problems. Cassandra's always been a bit different, my mother would tell relatives who asked about my plans. She's very independent, but sometimes I worry she doesn't know how to ask for help when she needs it. The truth was I'd been meeting with investors, studying market analytics, and developing relationships with vendors. But when I graduated and immediately started working 16-hour days, my family interpreted this as desperation rather than ambition. Delilah, who was 3 years older and had followed the traditional path, law school, corporate job, engagement to her college boyfriend, had appointed herself as my life coach. She'd spent the last 5 years offering unsolicited advice about my career choices, my appearance, and my social life. The problem with Cassandra, she'd explained to our cousin Rebecca at last year's Thanksgiving dinner, is that she doesn't understand networking. She thinks hard work is enough, but you need connections to get anywhere in business. She's stuck in this entry-level mindset. Entry-level mindset. This from a woman whose idea of a major business decision was choosing between two pre-approved legal briefs at her mid-tier law firm. The family narrative had solidified around several key assumptions about my life. My job, they believed I worked for someone else's small catering company, probably making around $35,000 a year. When I tried to explain that I owned my own business, they'd assumed I meant I was freelancing or running some kind of side hustle. It's sweet that Cassandra calls herself an entrepreneur, Delilah had told her law firm colleagues. We all have to start somewhere, right? My living situation. Because I drove a practical car and dressed simply, they'd concluded I was struggling financially. My mother had actually offered to help me with rent payments twice, and Delilah had given me gift cards to discount stores with notes about helping you build a nice wardrobe on a budget. My social life, the fact that I didn't date publicly or bring men to family events, had convinced them I was either too busy working to have a personal life or struggling with confidence issues. Poor Cassandra, Jennifer Walsh had whispered to her husband at the birthday dinner. 28 and still single. It must be so hard watching her sister's success. My financial status was the biggest misconception. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my financial struggles based on surface-level observations. I shopped at Target instead of Nordstrom. I brought homemade gifts to family occasions instead of expensive ones. I declined expensive group dinners and family vacations. To them, this looked like someone living paycheck to paycheck. The reality was that I'd developed these habits during my business's early years, when every dollar needed to be reinvested, and they'd simply become my lifestyle. Why spend $200 on a dinner when $30 would be just as satisfying? Why buy a $500 purse when a $50 one served the same function? My family saw frugality and assumed poverty. Delilah had been particularly vocal about her concerns. I worry about Cassandra's financial future, she'd told our parents 6 months ago. She's almost 30 and she has no savings, no investments, no real career trajectory. What happens when she gets older and can't keep up with the physical demands of event setup? Physical demands of event setup. She thought I was still personally moving tables and hanging decorations. The most frustrating part was how they'd rewritten history to fit their narrative. When I'd bought my house 3 years ago, I'd invited the family over for a housewarming party. Instead of recognizing it as a sign of success, they'd convinced themselves I was house-sitting for wealthy clients or had gotten in over my head with a mortgage I couldn't afford. It's a beautiful house, my father had said carefully. But Cassandra, are you sure you can handle the payments? These big places come with big expenses. When I explained that I'd paid cash, they'd exchanged looks that clearly communicated their belief that I was lying to save face. The idea that their struggling daughter had paid $1.8 million in cash for a custom home was simply incompatible with their established narrative. Even my appearance had been misinterpreted. I preferred classic, understated clothing, well-made pieces in neutral colors that would last for years. To my family, this looked like someone trying to appear successful on a budget. Delilah had actually complimented me once on how put together I looked, considering your circumstances. The birthday situation had made everything worse. From the moment Delilah started planning her Dirty 30 glamour bash, she'd been hyper-aware of how our family would appear to her law firm colleagues. She'd coached our parents on conversation topics, suggested they avoid mentioning certain relatives, and specifically instructed everyone to keep discussions about my career vague. Just say Cassandra works in events. Don't get into details. The people coming to my party move in circles where people have very specific ideas about success, and I don't want them to feel sorry for us. Feel sorry for us because she was ashamed of having a sister who appeared to be unsuccessful? The final piece of their constructed narrative was the most painful. They'd decided I was bitter about Delilah's success. When I didn't gush over her promotion or her new townhouse or her engagement, they interpreted my low-key responses as jealousy or resentment. Cassandra's having a hard time with my birthday celebration, she'd confided to our mother 6 months ago. She's almost 30 and she has no savings, no investments, no real career trajectory. What happens when she gets older and can't keep up with the physical demands of event setup? Physical demands of event setup. She thought I was still personally moving tables and hanging decorations. The most frustrating part was how they'd explained my absence from family events over the years. When I'd missed Christmas Eve dinner because I was managing a New Year's Eve corporate gala for 600 people, they'd assumed I was working retail during the holidays out of financial necessity. When I'd skipped Easter brunch because I was coordinating a tech conference in Seattle, they'd decided I was avoiding family gatherings because I was embarrassed about my life. Cassandra's having a difficult period had become my mother's standard explanation. She's working very hard to build something, but it's been challenging for her. Challenging. If only they knew that the challenge was deciding whether to acquire the boutique hotel chain in Northern California or focus on expanding my corporate event division into the Pacific Northwest. As I scrolled through the frantic messages on my phone, Delilah confirming party details, vendors asking for final headcounts, family members excited about tonight's celebration, I realized that their carefully constructed narrative was about to collapse entirely.
They'd built a story where I was the struggling younger sister who didn't fit into their successful world. In about 8 hours, they were going to discover that I wasn't just successful, I was more successful than any of them had ever imagined. And the sister who had kicked me out of her birthday party for not being good enough was about to learn that her perfect venue belonged to the family disappointment she'd been pitying for years. By 2:30 p.m., my phone had become a symphony of chaos, and I hadn't answered a single call. At 3:15 p.m., exactly 6 hours before Delilah's birthday party was scheduled to begin, I made the phone call that would change everything. I was sitting in my home office watching the late afternoon sun reflect off Lake Serenity through my panoramic windows when I finally decided that 6 years of being underestimated was enough. "Nathan," I said when my operations director answered, "I need you to cancel tonight's Holloway birthday celebration at Lakewood Gardens. Full refund, effective immediately." Nathan Rodriguez had been with Cascade Events since the early days, back when we only owned 2 properties and I was still doing site visits personally. He'd seen the company grow from an ambitious startup to a regional powerhouse, and he'd never questioned my business decisions. But this one clearly caught him off guard. "Boss, that's going to be complicated. Everything's set up. Vendors are confirmed. Staff is scheduled. The client's been planning this for months." "I understand the complications," I said, maintaining the calm tone that had served me well in countless business negotiations. "Handle it professionally, but make it clear the cancellation is coming from ownership level. And Nathan, make sure they understand that neither Lakewood Gardens nor any other Cascade Events property will be available for future events involving the Holloway family."
There was a pause on the other end. Nathan had handled difficult clients before, but he'd never seen me make a decision based on personal reasons. Should I give them a reason for the cancellation? Tell them that ownership has decided to implement a new policy regarding client suitability and brand alignment. Keep it corporate. After ending the call with Nathan, I sat back and considered the magnitude of what I'd just set in motion. In approximately 2 hours, my family would receive a call that would destroy months of planning and create chaos that would ripple through their social and professional circles. But before I could feel any satisfaction about the immediate consequences, I needed to understand exactly how they'd managed to dismiss every sign of my success over the years. The signs had been hiding in plain sight, but my family had been so committed to their narrative that they'd developed an almost supernatural ability to ignore evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Take my house, for instance. When I'd bought the property 3 years ago, the real estate transaction had been covered in the local business journal as one of the largest cash purchases in Westmont Valley history. The article had mentioned that the buyer was a young entrepreneur in the hospitality industry. My parents subscribed to that same journal, but they'd somehow missed the connection. During the housewarming party, they'd admired my home theater system without realizing they were looking at equipment that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The smart home technology was cutting-edge automation that wasn't even available to most consumers yet. The wine cellar contained bottles from vineyards that didn't sell to the general public, but they'd focused on the house being too big for one person and worried about my ability to afford the utilities. My travel schedule should have raised questions too. Over the past year, I'd been to Dubai, Singapore, London, and Vancouver, not for vacation, but for business. I'd coordinated international corporate events, consulted on venue development projects, and attended industry conferences where I was often a featured speaker. When I mentioned these trips during family dinners, they assumed it was personal travel funded by credit cards I couldn't afford. Cassandra's always been a dreamer, my mother would say when I mentioned upcoming international travel. I just hope she's not getting herself into debt trying to live beyond her means. The professional relationships in my life were equally misunderstood. When the mayor of Ridgewood Heights had called me during a family barbecue, they'd assumed it was a wrong number. When the governor's chief of staff had personally thanked me at a charity event, they thought it was a case of mistaken identity. When business magazines mentioned Cascade events and their coverage of regional economic growth, they assumed it was a coincidence that a company shared my business name. The most telling oversight was their complete lack of curiosity about my actual work. They'd never asked me to see my office, never inquired about my clients, never shown interest in the specific events I managed. If they had, they would have discovered that my little catering company had coordinated birthday celebrations for tech executives, anniversary parties for pharmaceutical CEOs, and launch events for companies whose names appeared regularly in financial news. But asking those questions would have required abandoning their established narrative, and they were too invested in seeing me as the family member who needed guidance. Even my charitable work had been misinterpreted. I served on the board of 2 nonprofit organizations and had quietly funded several community development projects over the years. When they saw my name in donor lists or event programs, they assumed it was volunteer work or token involvement for networking purposes. Last year, I'd anonymously funded the complete renovation of the children's playground at Westmont Community Park. The project cost $150,000, and the dedication ceremony had included a small plaque recognizing the generous contribution of a local business leader who wished to remain unnamed. My parents had attended that ceremony with me, and when they'd read the plaque, they'd wondered aloud about which wealthy family had made such a generous donation. The business contacts in my phone would have told the complete story. I had direct numbers for venue owners across 3 states, celebrity event planners, luxury service providers, and corporate executives whose companies appeared on Fortune 500 lists.
My calendar was filled with meetings that would have impressed even Jennifer Walsh and her law firm colleagues. But my family had trained themselves not to see these signs. They'd created a comfortable narrative where I was struggling but proud, working hard but not succeeding, trying to better myself but falling short. Acknowledging the evidence of my success would have meant admitting they'd been wrong about me for years. The most painful part was that I'd stopped trying to correct their assumptions years ago. Early in my business's growth, I'd attempted to share my successes with them. When I'd landed my first major corporate client, I'd called my mother, excited to share the news. Her response had been dismissive. "That's nice, honey, but don't get your hopes up too high. These things have a way of falling through." When my business had been featured in Regional Commerce Monthly as one of the area's fastest growing companies, I'd brought the magazine to a family dinner. Delilah had glanced at it and said, "It's sweet that they include small businesses in these things. It must be encouraging for people just starting out." After enough dismissive responses, I'd learned to keep my successes to myself. It was easier to let them maintain their assumptions than to constantly fight for recognition of my achievements. Now, as I prepared to make the second call that would reshape this entire situation, I realized that all those overlooked clues were about to converge into an undeniable truth. The struggling sister they'd been pitying owned the venue where Delilah's perfect birthday party was supposed to happen in less than 6 hours. I picked up my phone and dialed Rebecca Chen, the corporate attorney who had handled all of my major business acquisitions over the past 4 years. Rebecca was the kind of lawyer who charged $750 an hour and earned every penny through precision, preparation, and an intimidating command of corporate law. "Rebecca," I said when she answered, "I need you to prepare documentation showing the complete ownership structure of all Cascade Events properties. Full portfolio summary ready for immediate transmission." "Personal or professional matter?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was already mentally shifting into legal mode. "Both. My family is dealing with a venue situation that they don't realize is connected to my business operations. They've made some assumptions that need to be corrected with complete legal clarity." "I see. Do you need documentation of corporate structure, financial standing, or operational control?" "All of the above. I want there to be no ambiguity about who owns what and who makes decisions about business operations." As I ended the call with Rebecca, I realized that the carefully orchestrated revelation I was planning would do more than just embarrass my family or prove them wrong. It would force them to confront the fundamental flaw in how they approached relationships and success. For years, they've been so focused on surface appearances and conventional markers of achievement that they'd completely missed recognizing real accomplishment when it didn't fit their expectations. Tonight, that blindness was going to cost them more than just a birthday party. It was going to cost them their understanding of reality itself. At exactly 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes before guests were scheduled to arrive at Lakewood Gardens, my phone exploded with the chaos I'd been anticipating all day. The first call came from Delilah, her voice pitched so high with panic that I could barely understand the words tumbling out of her mouth. "Cassie, something terrible has happened. The venue just called and canceled my party. They said it was an ownership decision and they're refunding everything, but there are 200 people coming and we have nowhere to go and—" I let her hyperventilate for exactly 30 seconds before interrupting with a calm that must have sounded almost eerie given the circumstances. "Delilah, slow down. What exactly did they tell you?" "They said the ownership decided to implement some new policy about client suitability and brand alignment. What does that even mean? And they said no Cascade Events property would work with our family in the future. I don't understand what we could have done wrong." Cascade Events. She'd said the name without making the connection, just like she'd been doing for years. Even in crisis, my family's ability to miss obvious clues remained remarkably intact. "That does sound serious," I replied, maintaining my neutral tone. "Have you tried calling other venues?"
Of course we have. Do you think we're idiots? But everything decent is booked months in advance. Mom and Dad are calling every place they can think of. But it's Saturday evening, and most places don't even answer their phones.
The desperation in her voice was real, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt. But then I remembered her words from 2 weeks ago. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or out of place. She'd made her choice about who deserved to be included in her life. Now she was experiencing the consequences of excluding someone who had more power over her situation than she'd ever imagined. The second wave of calls came rapid fire over the next hour, my mother crying and asking if I knew anyone in the event planning industry who might help. My father, practical, as always, wondering if I had connections through my catering work who might have last-minute availability. Various relatives who'd heard about the crisis and were calling to see if I had any ideas. Each conversation was an exercise in restraint. They were turning to me for help navigating an industry crisis, not realizing they were asking advice from the person who controlled the very infrastructure they desperately needed. The irony was so complete, it was almost artistic. But it was the call from Jennifer Walsh at 7:23 p.m. that finally pushed me toward action. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. Cassandra, I understand there's been a venue emergency. As someone who works in event planning, surely you must have professional connections who could assist. This situation reflects poorly on all of us, and I'm sure you understand the importance of finding a solution. The condescension was breathtaking. Even in crisis, Jennifer couldn't resist treating me like a subordinate who should be grateful for the opportunity to prove her worth by fixing their problem. She was asking the owner of 8 premier venues to use her connections to help them find somewhere else to hold their party. I might be able to help, I said carefully, but I'd need to understand exactly what happened with the cancellation. Could you put me on speaker with everyone who's there? 10 minutes later, I was connected to a conference call that included my parents, Delilah, her fiancé Marcus, Jennifer, and 2 other colleagues from her law firm, and my Aunt Susan, who'd driven over to help with the crisis management. The dining room at my parents' house had apparently become command central for their desperate venue search. Cassandra, thank God, my mother's voice came through first. We're at a complete loss. The venue gave us no real explanation, just some corporate nonsense about policies and brand alignment. We've never even dealt with this Cascade Events company before today. Never dealt with Cascade Events, the company that had coordinated my cousin's wedding 2 years ago, handled the law firm's holiday party last December, and managed the charity auction where my parents had been guests of honor 6 months ago. Their ability to compartmentalize information was truly impressive. Well, I said, letting a note of consideration enter my voice, I might know someone who can provide some clarity about what happened. Let me make a call. What I actually did was text Nathan Rodriguez, conference call in 5 minutes, follow my lead, and provide complete documentation of ownership and the cancellation decision. When I called back, I'd arranged for what I told them was a 3-way call with a contact at a major event planning company who might be able to help. Nathan's voice came through with professional authority as I introduced him as the operations director for a premier hospitality firm. Good evening, everyone. I understand you're dealing with a venue cancellation that's created some confusion. Let me see if I can provide some clarity about what happened. Yes, please, Delilah's voice was strained with exhaustion and stress. We just need to understand why Lakewood Gardens would cancel on us with no warning. We've been planning this for months. Nathan's response was delivered with the kind of corporate precision that left no room for argument. The cancellation was authorized at the ownership level after it came to management's attention that a family member had been excluded from tonight's celebration due to what was termed professional and social inadequacy. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in my parents' dining room. I'm sorry, Jennifer's voice came through carefully, but what does that have to do with venue policy? Cascade Events maintains very specific standards about inclusivity and family values. When ownership learned that Miss Cassandra Holloway had been uninvited from her sister's birthday celebration because she allegedly didn't meet certain professional standards, the decision was made that this family's values were incompatible with our brand. Another silence, this one charged with the beginning of understanding. Wait. My father's voice was slow, confused. How would the venue ownership know about our family's personal decisions?
Nathan's answer was delivered with perfect timing, because Miss Cassandra Holloway is the founder and CEO of Cascade Events and Hospitality. She owns Lakewood Gardens, along with 7 other premium venues across the Westmont Valley. The cancellation was her personal decision after being told she wasn't welcome at tonight's celebration. The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and chaotic. I could hear Delilah screaming, my mother gasping, Jennifer trying to ask clarifying questions, and several people talking at once in voices too overlapping to distinguish. But underneath it all, I could hear my father's voice, quiet and stunned. Cassandra owns the venue?
I let the chaos continue for exactly 47 seconds before speaking, my voice cutting through their panic with the kind of calm authority I used in corporate boardrooms. Yes, I own Lakewood Gardens. I also own Silverstone Manor, the venue you originally wanted but were told was too exclusive for your event. I've owned both properties for over 3 years. That's impossible. Delilah's voice was barely a whisper. You work for a catering company. You can barely afford your apartment. I work for Cascade Events because I own Cascade Events. The apartment you're concerned about is actually a custom-built house on 35 acres of waterfront property. And the catering company you think I work for generated $8.7 million in revenue last year. Jennifer's voice, when it finally came, carried none of its earlier authority. Cassandra, if this is true, then why didn't you ever tell us? Tell you what? That I was successful? I tried. Remember when I mentioned working with major corporations? You assumed I meant designing menus for office parties. When I talked about international projects, you thought I meant catering for embassy receptions. When I bought my house, instead of asking how I afforded it, you assumed I was financially irresponsible. The accuracy of this hit them with visible force, even through the phone. You were so invested in seeing me as failing that you ignored every sign of success. When I traveled for business, you worried about my credit card debt. When I gave expensive gifts, you assumed I'd found discount packages. When I worked long hours, you assumed I was desperate rather than building something extraordinary. My mother's voice, when she finally spoke, was small and broken. Sweetheart, we thought we were helping. We thought you needed guidance. You thought you were helping by arranging job interviews for someone whose company employs 189 people? You thought I needed guidance from people who've never run a business, never coordinated an international event, never managed a multi-million-dollar operation. The truth was harsh, but it needed to be said. For 6 years, I'd watched them construct elaborate explanations for my perceived failures while dismissing every indication of my actual achievements. Delilah, I continued, my voice steady but unyielding, you kicked me out of your birthday party because you were ashamed of what you thought my life looked like. You told me I didn't fit the professional and social standards you wanted for your celebration. You excluded me because you thought I would embarrass you in front of your successful friends. I paused, letting the weight of her decision settle over the call. What you actually did was exclude someone who owns the venue where you planned to celebrate, who has business relationships with half the vendors you hired, and who controls more resources in this industry than anyone else you know. You weren't protecting your reputation from your struggling sister. You were insulting someone whose success exceeds anything you've ever achieved. The silence that followed wasn't just shock. It was the sound of an entire family's understanding of reality collapsing in real time. 18 months after the birthday party that never happened, I sat in the executive boardroom of Cascade Events' new headquarters, reviewing the architectural plans for our latest acquisition, a historic mansion in Charleston that would become our first property outside the Westmont Valley. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now expanding into markets I'd only dreamed of reaching when my family still thought I was struggling to pay rent. The transformation in family dynamics hadn't been immediate or easy. The first few weeks after the revelation had been marked by a silence so complete that I'd wondered if I'd permanently severed relationships that, despite everything, still mattered to me.
But gradually, tentatively, my family had begun the difficult work of rebuilding their understanding not just of me, but of how they approach success, assumptions, and each other. The change had started with my father. 3 days after the canceled birthday party, he'd shown up at my real office, not the cramped workspace they'd imagined, but the glass-walled executive suite overlooking Lake Serenity. He'd stood in the doorway for a full minute, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the conference table that seated 12, and the wall of industry awards that told the story of Cascade Events' rise to regional prominence. "I've never actually seen where you work," he'd said quietly. "I mean, I knew you had an office, but I imagined something like a cubicle in a shared space. This is incredible." That conversation had lasted 4 hours. My father, an engineer by training, had asked detailed questions about business operations, growth strategies, and financial management. For the first time in years, someone in my family was treating me as an expert in my own field rather than someone who needed guidance about basic career decisions. "I keep thinking about all the times we offered you advice, all the times we worried about your financial situation, suggested you needed a more stable job, wondered if you were making good choices. We were giving business advice to someone who was building something we couldn't even comprehend." My mother's transformation had been more emotional, but equally profound. She'd spent weeks going through old family photos and conversations, recognizing moments where she'd missed signs of my success. The expensive wine I'd brought to family dinners wasn't a splurge I couldn't afford. It was from a collection worth more than most people's annual salaries. The simple gifts I'd given weren't budget constraints. They were carefully chosen items that often cost more than the flashy presents others brought.
"I found the article about your house purchase," she'd told me during one of our rebuilding conversations. "The one in the business journal that called it one of the largest cash transactions in regional real estate history. I remember reading that article when it came out. I remember wondering who the young entrepreneur was. I never connected it to you because I'd already decided what your story was." But it was Delilah's journey that had been the most complicated and, ultimately, the most meaningful. The sister who had excluded me from her birthday party because of my perceived inadequacies had spent months grappling with the reality that she'd insulted someone whose professional achievements dwarfed her own. Her first attempt at reconciliation had been awkward and misguided. She called 2 weeks after the revelation, asking if Cascade Events might cater her law firm's upcoming holiday party. The request itself revealed that she still didn't fully understand the scope of what I'd built. She was trying to hire the owner of a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire to provide catering services for a mid-tier law firm. "Delilah," I'd said gently, "Cascade Events doesn't do catering. We own venues and coordinate large-scale events. What you're asking is like requesting that the owner of a luxury hotel chain come personally deliver room service." The conversation that followed had been painful, but necessary. Delilah had been forced to confront not just her misunderstanding of my career, but her fundamental approach to measuring success and worth. She'd built her entire identity around being the successful sister, the one who had followed the traditional path and achieved conventional markers of achievement. Discovering that her struggling younger sister had actually surpassed her in every measurable way had required a complete reconstruction of her self-image. But the real breakthrough had come 6 months later, when Delilah had asked to visit my house, not as a family obligation, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the life I'd built. She'd walked through the custom-designed spaces, the art collection, the home office that was larger than her entire apartment, and had finally asked the question that had been driving her confusion. "Why didn't you want us to know? Why hide all of this?" The answer had been more complex than she'd expected. I'd explained about the early years when sharing successes had been met with dismissal or skepticism, about learning that it was easier to let them maintain their assumptions than to constantly fight for recognition, about how their narrative of my struggles had become so entrenched that contradicting it felt impossible.
But there's something else, I'd added. I'd spent so many years watching our family measure people's worth by their apparent success that I wanted to see if anyone would value me for who I was rather than what I'd achieved. And for 6 years, the answer was no. That conversation had marked the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one based on curiosity rather than assumption, support rather than judgment. The broader family transformation had been equally remarkable. The relatives who had spent years offering me unsolicited career advice had become asking genuine questions about business strategy and entrepreneurship. My cousin Rebecca, who had always been interested in starting her own marketing consultancy, had asked for guidance about business planning and client development. Instead of receiving lectures about unrealistic expectations, she got an actionable advice from someone who had actually built a successful company from scratch. The change had extended beyond professional matters. Family gatherings had become opportunities for real conversation rather than surface-level status updates. When my Uncle David had been considering a career change at 55, instead of politely discouraging him, the family had drawn on their experience of misjudging my situation to offer genuine support for his exploration of new possibilities. The business world had also taken notice of the family dynamics that had played out around Cascade events. Harvard Business School had reached out about including our story in a case study on family businesses and communication. The request had come after an industry publication had written about the venue cancellation and subsequent revelation, framing it as an example of how assumptions about women entrepreneurs could blind people to significant business success. I had declined the Harvard request. Some stories were too personal for academic analysis, but I'd agreed to speak at several conferences about the challenges of building businesses and industries where young women weren't expected to hold leadership positions. 2 years after the birthday party crisis, my relationship with Delilah had evolved into something neither of us had expected: genuine friendship between equals. She'd stopped trying to give me career advice and had started asking for it. When her law firm had been considering expansion into corporate event planning, she'd consulted me about market analysis and strategic positioning. "I have a confession," she'd told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "I've been recommending Cascade events to every business contact I have. Not because you're my sister, but because after watching you work, I understand that you've built something extraordinary." As I sat in my boardroom that afternoon, reviewing expansion plans that would double our company's footprint within 2 years, I reflected on the unexpected gift that had emerged from that devastating birthday party cancellation. The family that had spent years underestimating me had learned to recognize achievement in forms they'd never considered. More importantly, they'd learned to approach each other with curiosity rather than judgment. The story that had begun with exclusion based on perceived inadequacy had transformed into something much more valuable: a family that had learned to celebrate authentic success and support unconventional paths. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong about your failures. Sometimes it's teaching them to recognize success when it doesn't look like what they expected. And sometimes the most meaningful transformation happens not when people finally see you clearly, but when they learn to see everyone clearly, including themselves. What's your story? Have you ever had your achievements dismissed by people who didn't understand your path? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about hidden success and family dynamics. Tomorrow, I'm sharing the story of a teacher who discovered that her problem student was actually running a 6-figure online business. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Next up, 2 more stories chosen just for you. If you enjoyed this, you'll want to see what's coming. Tap to keep going.